Kia ora, my name's Fiona Brooker. I'm here to tell you the tale of Lost at Sea, the mystery of Percy Taylor. And our friend Percy James Taylor was born on the 9th of December 1903 in Littleton, which is the port town just outside of Christchurch, New Zealand. His parents, James and Mary Taylor, had him baptised in 1904 at the Roman Catholic Church, and his auntie Adeline Sweeney was his godparent. When his family moved across the Port Hills into Christchurch, he attended school in St Albans, which is a suburb. And in 1925, when he was old enough to actually appear on the electoral rolls in New Zealand, he gave his occupation as cook. But we next see Percy becoming in Percival. And Percival James Taylor met Nora Kathleen Catling. And it's thought that that is possibly through the fact that both of them had connections to the railways in New Zealand, and maybe that's how they met. But one thing that they definitely had in common was ballroom dancing. And they both danced through the Premier School of Dancing, as this newspaper article will show you. And it's through that newspaper that we find out that they actually were giving tangos and foxtrots and all sorts of things. And I'm sure that's probably also why we have this lovely photo of the couple in their finery. In 1927, they marry. And at the time, Percival gives his occupation as a hairdresser. And then they seem to disappear from New Zealand. Percival is listed in the electoral rolls, still living at his parents' address in 1935, but they'd actually moved in 1928. So this might have been a little bit of a hangover where the person hasn't updated the roll, and so they still appear in it and nobody has checked. Something to be careful of. However, we do find them again when over across the Tasman in Australia, we find Nora in Sydney petitioning for divorce with desertion given as the reason. The divorce was granted, and Nora went on to marry a widower, Thomas Judge, in 1945, and did spend the remaining part of her life in New South Wales. But what happened to Percival James Taylor? He does seem to disappear for periods of time. Well, actually, he comes back to New Zealand, and we pick him up on the military nominal rolls for World War II. And these rolls are found on Ancestry, and in this case here, we find out a little bit more information. So he's listing for the military. He's embarking in 1940. His listed place of residence is 10 Moa Point, Lyall Bay, Wellington. And his contact is his mother, M. Taylor of 98 Sullivan Ave. Totally correct address. Would suggest that maybe he has some contact with them. In fact, even the 10 Moa Point address in Lyall Bay is actually really close to where his uncle, Jim Sweeney, was living. So maybe it's the uncle that he's had contact with. If you're looking for military records in New Zealand, another good source is the Cenotaph, which is the Auckland War Memorial Museum's online record, and this covers multiple wars and conflicts. And if we search that, we can find Percival James Taylor on there, and sliding down on his screen, we find out that when he went off to World War II, he was a gunner, and it tells us his service number. Now, that service number and knowing that information is really, really useful, because then you can apply for his service records. And in these service records, we were able to find out more information. Now, one thing to be aware of with service records is they do take a little bit of time. There's quite a big demand for them, and I think these took about 6 months to turn up. But in this, we actually find out quite a lot more, because although his Cenotaph record gave his role as a gunner in World War II, he had actually transferred to the role of cook. But it was probably the medical board record in there that gave us the full information, which was describing his chronic alcoholism, noted that he'd suffered that at least 4 years prior to the war as well. And when you work that back, that's about the time that Nora was divorcing him. And so he was actually discharged from the army because of this. They couldn't work with him, and he was no use to them. Now, although this discharge document is 1942 in Wellington, when you actually work the dates through, he had actually left in March 1941, and likely when he was serving overseas. So again, he disappears. In fact, the next record we found that actually told us anything about him at all was Jim Sweeney's probate record. And here he had left his estate to his niece's nephews, including Percival, or Percy as the family called him. So what happened to him? Well, surprisingly enough, we actually go all the way to the other side of the world, where newspapers are being have advertisements listed looking for him. And this is in the 1960s. So this is linked to the will of Jim Sweeney and the probate of this process. And so there's a couple of different articles. One says that there's a possibility that he is living in Brighton or worked in Brighton in the 1930s. Now, it is assumed that that probably means Brighton in the UK, being that that is being put into a UK newspaper. However, there are Brightons in other places around the world as well. And so maybe this copy of the notice could have been posted in more than one newspaper. Here we also find out in a slightly later one that he was possibly in the Merchant Navy. So that suggests somebody has made contact and then actually given a little bit more information. And we get some ships listed down here: the British Scout, the Alan Claw, the British Glory, the Lord Byron, the Clan Matheson, and other ships. So now he's had slightly different information about what he's up to and where he is. Now, this has fortunately been collected by the Andrews Newspaper Index, and this has been a fantastic find because it told us so much more about what had happened to Percival. And note that he's called Percy in these articles. So then it's on to have a little bit more of a look at the Merchant Navy and what we can find out about him. We were able to find pictures of the ships. We know that the British Tanker Company was the owner of the British Scout and the British Glory, and that these ships were carrying oil. So this is sort of the 1960s and what is happening in his life, but there are some gaps. You know, we know he's born in 1903. He's a cook, he's a ballroom dancer, he's a hairdresser, he's a gunner, he's a cook again in the army, and then he's in the Merchant Navy, but there's quite a few gaps. And in fact, when you start to put them on a map, he's all about that place. He's in New Zealand, he's in Australia, he's in the UK. He's moving quite a lot around the world. So let's look a little bit further. Now that we know he's in the Merchant Navy, what other records can we find for him? And Ancestry had a really good collection of these. And although we might not have first looked at these because A, he's under Percival and he was already born Percy, we suddenly find him as Percival James Taylor. And we were able to find him on this record here for the Port Campbell, which tells us it arrived in New York in October 1941 from Glasgow. So remember I said he possibly left the army about March 1941? Well, here he is all of a sudden in the Merchant Navy and working for the European side of things. He's a second cook and baker. Well, that's sort of consistent, isn't it? And at the time, it says his length of service at sea is 10 years. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because that also sort of matches up with what we find on this card found in the British Merchant Seaman collection on Find My Past, where it tells us he's definitely born in Littleton, absolutely the right date of birth, and that he had previously done service in the New Zealand service. So maybe that gap in the 1930s when she goes to Australia, or maybe they both go to Australia, indicates some service there on shipping as well. We were able to find a photo of the Port Campbell too, but the best thing about these records is that you can start to timeline them. And the great thing about these shipping records is they have both when he was engaged on the ship, when he was departed, when he arrived at the next place, and what position he had on them. So from the engagements, you also get what he had engaged from, i.e. the previous ship he had sailed on. So we can really start putting them in, even though we might not actually have all the actual crew lists as such. We're actually putting little pieces together all the way through. So we can actually follow him through this time, get an idea of where he is, add some more ship names to this career that he has in the Merchant Navy. Here, for example, he's on a troop ship. This troop ship took voyages from Liverpool via Africa to Bombay in 1942, the period of time that he was on it. We know that he was an able baker on this voyage. It left Freetown as a convoy with the Alamazora. It met up with a different convoy of merchants, of 14 merchants and 10 escorts. It arrived in the Clyde, it returned to Liverpool, and it had 14 days of repairs. Well, you can actually start to trace quite a lot of information about the ships and their voyages. And then you find some random things which actually talks about the food on the ship as well. And being that he was the cook and the baker, maybe this was his cooking that they were talking about: bacon, eggs, boiled potatoes, porridge for breakfast, smoked teriyaki and potatoes. Doesn't sound too bad. Again, the next ship we find with the Lucilium, we can find out that this was a bulk fuel tanker. It's going Liverpool to New York. 3 escort oilers in the convoy, used as bait convoy for the German U-boats. So not exactly the safest place to be in World War II either. And in fact was part of a major U-boat attack. Fortunately, none of the convoy ships were harmed during that particular piece of action. The Samothrace, and I'm probably pronouncing these all wrong, but this is a Liberty ship, so we're also taking troops at this stage. Percival was on the voyage from New York in January 1944, heading to Italy, but it was actually recalled because they found it had some problems with the hull cracking. There's lots more information we can find out about these ships as well. And actually we can find out a little bit more than just World War II, because there are some further crew lists that are on Ancestry and on Find My Past that tell us a little bit more. So we're actually going post-World War II. We're in 46, 47 and 48, and he's still being the ship's cook on these voyages. So looking at our map now, we actually know where he was in those 1940s. He's sort of serving during World War II. So although he's left the army, he hasn't actually stopped serving. He's possibly put himself in even more danger on these ships going across the Atlantic and elsewhere. So Percival himself, 1903, 1910s, there's a little bit of a gap there still in those 1940s. What did happen between his discharge and his enlistment? Little bit of a mystery there, possibly in the 1950s, as to what ships that he was serving on. Maybe one day some records will come and become available to make that easy to find. Remember, we're doing this online and from New Zealand at this stage. And then what does happen to Percival? Well, he did remain a mystery for quite a long time, but eventually we found one death in England that would suggest it was him. He is thought to have died as a single man near Drury Lane on the 25th of December 1977, age 73. Unfortunately, no one claimed the body, and he was buried by the council in Pauper's grave. Whether his family ever knew that he died, whether he ever got in contact with the family again, it's not believed he did. No one in the family that we've talked to has ever known anything about Percival beyond those newspaper articles looking for him in the 1960s. So a brave man, a sad life to finish off with, but a very brave man. If you're wanting to get in contact with me, you can do so through my company Memories in Time. Maybe we can help you find some places that everyone has been. Thanks for listening.